I once believed our home was built on solid bricks, sturdy safe, a haven from the world. But that night in October 1957, I realized it was propped up by empty whiskey bottles, fragile and ready to collapse under the weight of one drunken rage. The rain hammered against our windows like angry fists, and inside the silence that followed would haunt me for years. This is how our family's hidden fractures turned into an unbreakable resolve, a story I've carried in my chest for decades, too heavy to speak but too important to bury. From the outside, we looked like any happy family in our quiet suburban neighborhood in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The white picket fence Tom had painted last spring gleamed in the morning sun, our small yard dotted with Lily's chalk drawings of butterflies and rainbows. I was Eleanor Murphy, 34 years old, rising at 4:30 each morning to work at Sullivan's Bakery on Main Street, my hands deep in flour and yeast before the rest of the world stirred. The work was hard, but honest kneading dough gave me time to think, to plan our modest dreams. Our son Max, 10 years old, with freckles scattered across his nose like constellation maps, spent his evenings sprawled on the living room floor, drawing elaborate rocket ships in a composition notebook. He'd explain to anyone who'd listen how he'd reach the moon someday, his eyes bright with the kind of certainty only children possess. His bedroom walls were covered with pictures he'd cut from Life magazine astronaut space capsules, the vast darkness that called to him. Then there was Lily, our 14-year-old daughter, all gangly limbs and infectious laughter that bubbled up whenever she sketched in her art notebook. She had Tom's dark hair, but my stubborn chin, and she could lose herself for hours drawing the rolling Iowa cornfields that stretched beyond our backyard. Her landscapes were so vivid you could almost feel the wind moving through them, see the storm clouds gathering on distant horizons. My husband Tom was the steady one, or so I thought. He fixed cars at Henderson's garage, coming home each evening with grease under his fingernails and stories about the townsfolk whose vehicles he'd brought back to life. He had gentle hands and a quick smile, the kind of man who'd stop to help a neighbor change a tire or carry groceries for elderly Mrs. Patterson next door. There was a time when our dinner table rang with laughter, when Tom's presence brought joy instead of tension. I remember one evening in early spring, before the drinking became a nightly ritual, when we sat around our small kitchen table sharing pot roast and stories from our day. "Dad, look at this," Max said, unfolding a piece of notebook paper covered in his careful pencil drawings. "This is my rocket design for getting to Mars. See, it has 3 stages, just like the ones in the magazine." Tom leaned over, studying the drawing with the same seriousness he'd give to an engine diagram at work. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he traced the rocket's trajectory with his finger. "Now that's impressive, son. But what about fuel efficiency? You'll need a lot of power to break through Earth's atmosphere." I thought about that. Max's face lit up with excitement, his fork forgotten in his mashed potatoes. "That's why I added these extra boosters here. They'll drop off once we're in space, making the ship lighter for the journey." "Smart thinking," Tom said, ruffling Max's hair affectionately. "Maybe you can teach those NASA fellows a thing or two when you're older." Lily looked up from her sketch pad where she'd been drawing while we talked. "I drew what I think Mars looks like," she said shyly, turning the page toward us. "It's all red and rocky, but I added some blue areas where maybe there could be water someday." Tom reached across the table to examine her artwork, his calloused fingers careful not to smudge her pencil lines. "Lily, this is beautiful. You've got real talent, sweetheart. Look at how you captured the shadows on those rocks. It makes them look 3-dimensional. You really think so?" she asked, her face glowing with pride. "I know. So," Tom said firmly, his voice warm with paternal love. "Your mother and I are raising an artist and an astronaut. Who knows, maybe someday Max will fly to Mars and Lily will paint pictures of what he finds there." The children giggled at the idea, Max pretending to plant a flag on Lily's drawing, while she protested laughingly that he was messing up her artwork. I felt a warm contentment settle over me as I watched my family dream together. Tom caught my eye across the table and winked his expression full of love for our life our children, our simple happiness. Eleanor, he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. We're lucky people, aren't we? Look at what we've built together. That memory feels like it belonged to different people now, but it was real. Tom was capable of tenderness, of being present and engaged with our children, which made what came later so much more devastating, not just the betrayal itself, but the knowledge that he'd chosen to destroy something genuine and beautiful. Another afternoon stands out in my memory, a Saturday in late summer, when Tom was teaching Max how to change the oil in our old Buick. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard their voices drifting from the garage, Tom's patient and instructive, Max's eager and full of questions. Now, son, the most important thing is to make sure the car's been sitting for a while so the oil isn't hot, Tom was saying as I stepped outside with glasses of lemonade. Hot oil can burn you badly, and there's no repair job worth getting hurt over. Max nodded solemnly, his small hands gripping the wrench Tom had given him. The tool looked oversized in his 10-year-old grasp, but Tom's hands covered his, guiding the movement with infinite patience. Like this, Dad. That's perfect. See how you're turning it counterclockwise. Remember righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. That'll serve you well in life, not just with cars. I watched Tom guide Max's hands, showing him how to position the drain pan, explaining why each step mattered. His movements were sure and gentle, the same hands that could coax life back into a dying engine, now teaching his son the basics of mechanical knowledge. There was something profound in the moment, the passing of skills from father to son, the quiet intimacy of shared work. Why do we have to change the oil anyway? Max asked, peering into the dark liquid flowing from the car. Well, Tom said, settling into his teaching voice, oil is like the blood in your body. It helps all the moving parts work together smoothly, but over time, it gets dirty and thick. If you don't change it, the engine will seize up and die. Taking care of things you depend on, that's what being a man is all about. Max absorbed this wisdom with the seriousness of a student learning life's essential lessons. His face was smudged with oil, his shirt already destined for the washing machine, but his attention never wavered from his father's instruction. When the job was finished and they'd cleaned up their tools, Tom lifted Max onto his shoulders for a victory lap around the yard, both of them laughing as Lily cheered from her perch on the porch steps. Your boys are quite a team, Mrs. Patterson called from her garden, smiling at the sight of them. That they are, I replied, my heart full of pride and love. Tom was a good father, then patient and kind, invested in teaching our children not just skills, but values. The man who could explain engine maintenance with such care, who celebrated Max's curiosity and encouraged Lily's artistic dreams, how could that same person become the monster who would destroy our family? But those same gentle hands reached for a beer the moment he walked through our door each evening. Just one, he'd say, to wash the day away. Then another, with dinner. By 9 o'clock, it was whiskey. Jim Beam in a glass tumbler, the amber liquid catching the lamplight as he settled into his worn recliner. I'd dismiss it as work stress, convincing myself it was harmless. Men in our town drank. It was what they did after long days of honest labor. The change was gradual, so subtle that I convinced myself I was imagining it. The laughter at dinner became less frequent, replaced by Tom's increasingly slurred commentary on everything from the evening news to Max's homework struggles. His jokes grew sharper, meaner, often at Lily's expense. Look at our little artist. He'd say, his words thick with whiskey as Lily showed us her latest drawing. Always got her head in the clouds drawing pretty pictures while the real world goes on around her. Art doesn't put food on the table, sweetheart. Maybe you should focus on something more practical. Lily's face would fall, her enthusiasm dimming like a candle in wind. She'd excuse herself early, claiming homework, her forced smile never quite reaching her eyes as she kissed my cheek goodnight. I should have seen it then, the way she began to shrink inward, the way her shoulders tensed whenever Tom's voice took on that particular edge. I began to notice how she'd tense when his drinking began, how she'd find reasons to stay in her room once the whiskey bottle appeared. Max would retreat to his bedroom too, though he was better at hiding his discomfort behind chatter about his spacebooks and rocket designs. One evening in September, I found myself standing in the doorway between our kitchen and living room, watching Tom drain his third glass of whiskey while Max struggled with long division at the kitchen table. Lily had already disappeared upstairs, claiming she needed to finish a book report. "Tom," I said quietly, approaching his chair, "maybe we could have some evenings without drinking. The children seem—" He looked up at me with those brown eyes. I'd fallen in love with the ones that used to crinkle with laughter, but now held a glassy, distant quality. "Eleanor, honey, you worry too much." He patted his lap, and I reluctantly sat down, feeling the bourbon on his breath as he pulled me close. "A man needs to unwind after working all day to support his family. I work hard for you and these kids. I deserve this small pleasure." "I know you work hard," I said carefully, choosing my words like stepping stones across dangerous water. "But sometimes the children seem uncomfortable when you've been drinking." His arms tightened around me, not affectionately, but possessively. "The children are fine, Eleanor. They understand that Daddy works hard to give them a good life. If they seem uncomfortable, maybe it's because their mother is putting ideas in their heads." The conversation ended there, dissolved in his embrace, and my desperate need to believe him. But I noticed how Lily's shoulders tensed when he raised his voice, how she'd invented elaborate excuses to avoid being alone with him. Looking back now, I see how those moments chipped away at our facade, how her occasional flinches around him hinted at something darker brewing beneath our careful normalcy. The changes in Tom accelerated through the fall. His drinking started earlier: a beer, with lunch on weekends, a shot of whiskey before dinner on weekdays. His temper became unpredictable, flaring over minor infractions, like Max leaving his bicycle in the driveway, or Lily talking too loudly on the phone with her friends. But it was the way he looked at Lily that began to disturb me most. There was something different in his gaze when she walked through the room, a lingering quality that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't name why. When she'd bend over her homework at the kitchen table, I'd catch him staring at her developing figure with an expression I'd never seen before, hungry, calculating, wrong. "Tom," I said one evening after watching him watch her for too long, "is everything all right? You seem distracted lately." "Just tired, honey," he replied, but his eyes followed Lily as she carried her books upstairs. "Our little girl is growing up, isn't she? Not so little anymore." The comment sent a chill down my spine, though I told myself I was overreacting. Fathers noticed when their daughters grew up. It was natural, wasn't it? But something in his tone suggested otherwise, something that made me want to step between them to shield her from his gaze. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Friday night in late October, the kind of tempest that rattles windows and sends loose shutters banging against clapboard siding. Tom staggered in after 10 later than usual, his face flushed and his tie askew. He'd been at Murphy's Tavern, ironic given our shared surname, drowning some unnamed sorrow in bourbon and beer. The scent of alcohol rolled off him in waves as he collapsed onto our threadbare couch, muttering about ungrateful customers and bills that never seemed to shrink. I was in the basement folding laundry, trying to get ahead of the weekend chores, when I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was faint at first, barely audible over the washing machine's rumble and the storm's fury, but unmistakable once it registered sobbing. Not the frustrated tears of homework struggles or the dramatic wails of teenage heartbreak, but something raw and desperate that seemed to claw its way up from the depths of terror. My hand stilled on one of Max's school shirts as the sound drifted down from upstairs. Every maternal instinct I possessed screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. I dropped the laundry basket and took the basement stairs 2 at a time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The hallway upstairs was dark, except for the thin line of light bleeding from beneath Lily's bedroom door. The sobbing was clearer now, punctuated by muffled sounds I couldn't identify, a rhythmic, creaking whispered words I couldn't make out the sound. of something being knocked over. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, some primitive part of my brain, already understanding what I might find, but refusing to accept it. I cracked the door open just an inch, and the world, as I knew it, ended. There was Tom, the man I'd married for his gentle laugh and steady hands, the father who'd taught our children to ride bicycles and change motor oil. But this wasn't the Tom I knew. This was a monster wearing his face, his body heavy and predatory, as he forced himself on our daughter. Lily's face was turned toward the door, tears streaming down her cheeks, her small hands pushing weakly against his chest as she whimpered his name, begging him to stop. Time shattered in that instant. 20 years of marriage collapsed into fragments. Our wedding day, dancing to Moon River in the church hall, clashed violently with this nightmare unfolding before me. The man who'd held my hand through labor pains, who'd cried when each of our children took their first steps, was destroying the innocence of our baby girl. Horror surged through me like ice water in my veins. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the rage that exploded in my chest like a bomb going off. Every protective instinct I'd ever felt as a mother crystallized into pure, violent fury. I threw the door open and charged into the room, my voice tearing from my throat in a scream that could have shattered glass. "Get off her! Get off her right now!" I grabbed Tom by the shoulders and yanked him away from Lily with strength I didn't know I possessed. He stumbled backward, his pants around his ankles, his face slack and confused in the dim light from her bedside lamp. The stench of whiskey rolled off him in nauseating waves, mixing with the sour smell of sweat and something else. Something that made my stomach turn. "Eleanor!" He slurred, blinking at me as if trying to bring me into focus. What's wrong? Well, don't you dare!" I snarled, positioning myself between him and Lily, who had curled into a tight ball on her bed, her nightgown torn and her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. "Don't you dare act like you don't know what you've done." I pulled Lily into my arms, feeling how small and fragile she was, how her whole body trembled against mine like a wounded bird. She smelled like fear and childhood, that lingering scent of strawberry shampoo mixing with something darker now, something that would never wash away completely. Mama," she whispered, her voice so small and broken it made my heart crack in half. "Mama, I tried to stop him. I tried so hard, but he wouldn't listen." Behind us, Tom was fumbling with his belt, muttering excuses that fell on deaf ears. I didn't mean..." The alcohol, the thunder outside seemed to echo the storm raging in my chest as I held my daughter and tried to process the unthinkable reality that our safe haven had become a house of horrors. In that moment, I knew our family was forever changed, that whatever we'd been before was gone, replaced by something I couldn't yet comprehend. The hours that followed were a blur of raw emotion and harsh reality that I'm still sorting through even now, decades later. Tom sobered up quickly once he realized the magnitude of what had happened, or perhaps more accurately, once he realized he'd been caught. He sat on the edge of our bed, his head in his hands, weeping what I now recognize as crocodile tears. "Eleanor, you have to understand," he kept saying, his voice thick with phony remorse. "I was drinking. I didn't know what I was doing. It wasn't really me, it was the alcohol talking. I would never hurt Lily. You know I love her." But I'd seen his eyes in that room, focused, deliberate, aware. Whatever darkness lived inside him, alcohol hadn't created it. It had simply stripped away the pretense that kept it hidden. The man I'd married, the father I'd trusted with our children's safety, had been a carefully constructed lie. I called the police at 6 a.m. after I'd helped Lily shower and tried to document everything I could remember. My hands shook as I dialed the number, knowing that this single phone call would change everything, would make our private nightmare public in ways I couldn't control. Officer Patterson, no relation to our neighbor, arrived, looking skeptical, his notepad barely filled after an hour of questions. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes that had seen too much domestic drama, and his attitude suggested he viewed this as another family dispute rather than a serious crime. Lily, still in shock, could barely string coherent sentences together. Her account came in fragments. He was drunk. He said I was pretty. He told me not to tell anyone. It hurt so much. I kept saying no, but he wouldn't stop. The officer looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen too much domestic drama. Mrs. Murphy, I understand you're upset, but alcohol makes people do things they regret. These situations are often more complicated than they first appear. Are you sure you want to put your family through the ordeal of prosecution? These cases are hard to prove, especially when it's family. I wanted to reach across that kitchen table and grab him by his uniform shirt, shake him until he understood that this wasn't about a family squabble or a moment of poor judgment. This was about my daughter's safety, her future, her ability to trust the world again. But I kept my voice steady, drawing on reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. Officer Patterson, my daughter was attacked by her father. I witnessed it with my own eyes. I don't care how hard it is to prove or how complicated it might be. I want him charged with sexual assault, and I want him kept away from my children. The hospital was a sterile maze of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells that would forever remind me of that day. I held Lily's hand through the rape kit examination, feeling each of her flinches as my own wanting to absorb her pain and carry it myself. The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Janet with kind eyes and gentle hands, explained each step as carefully as possible, but nothing could make the process less violating for a 14-year-old girl who'd already been through hell. Sweetheart, Janet whispered to Lily as she collected evidence, her voice soft and professional. You're very brave. Your mother loves you very much, and we're going to take good care of you. Lily just stared at the ceiling, her hand gripping mine so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. I wondered what thoughts were running through her head, what questions she was too afraid to ask, what blame she might be placing on herself. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the clinical sounds of medical procedures and my daughter's occasional whimpers of pain. When we finally left the hospital, Lily hadn't spoken in hours. She sat in the passenger seat of our car, staring out the window at the passing landscape, as if she were seeing it for the first time. Her silence was more frightening than any tears would have been. The legal process moved like cold molasses through the Iowa legal system. Weeks passed before lab results came back, confirming what we already knew but needed documented. Interviews stretched on endlessly with different officials, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, looking for inconsistencies in Lily's trauma-fractured memory. Each session felt like forcing her to relive that night, and I watched her withdraw further into herself with every retelling. Detective Morrison, who took over our case after the initial report, was more sympathetic than Officer Patterson, but even he seemed cautious about the prospects for prosecution. Mrs. Murphy, he explained during one of our meetings, cases like this are challenging. Without additional witnesses or a pattern of behavior, it often comes down to he said, she said. Defense attorneys are very good at creating reasonable doubt, especially when alcohol is involved. Our extended family's reaction cut almost as deeply as Tom's betrayal. His mother called me 3 days after his arrest, her voice sharp with accusation and disbelief. Eleanor Murphy, how dare you put that man in jail over some misunderstanding? Tom wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone his own daughter. You've always been jealous of how much he loves those children, haven't you? This is your way of getting back at him for working so hard to support the family. The accusation stung because it was so far from reality. Jealous, I'd given 20 years of my life to building a home with Tom, supporting his dreams, raising his children, maintaining the fiction of our happy marriage, even as his drinking made our lives increasingly difficult. My own sister Margaret visited with barely concealed skepticism. She sat in our living room, her lips pursed in disapproval, as she studied Lily, who was curled in the corner chair with her sketch pad. "Ellie, are you absolutely certain Lily didn't misunderstand something? You know how teenage girls can be dramatic, especially when they're looking for attention? And Tom's been under so much stress at work lately, maybe he was just trying to comfort her, and it got misinterpreted." The suggestion that Lily had somehow misinterpreted being raped made my blood boil, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Margaret, I saw what happened. There was no misunderstanding, no misinterpretation. Tom sexually assaulted our daughter, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make everyone else more comfortable." Even our pastor, Reverend Williams, suggested we might consider family counseling instead of destroying a godly marriage over what he delicately termed a moment of weakness brought on by the devil's drink. His visit to our home felt more like a mission to protect Tom's reputation than to offer spiritual comfort to his victims. "Eleanor," he said, his hands folded piously in his lap. "Marriage is a sacred covenant before God. Tom is clearly struggling with the demon of alcohol, but with prayer and counseling, families can heal. Think of the children. Do you really want them to grow up without their father? Do you want this scandal to follow them for the rest of their lives?" The isolation was suffocating. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid conversation. Other parents wouldn't let their children play with Max, as if our family's trauma might be contagious. I felt like we were living in a fishbowl, every move scrutinized and judged by people who preferred to believe that monsters wore obvious masks, not the faces of mechanics who fixed their cars and husbands who coached Little League. As I pushed forward with divorce proceedings and secured a restraining order, the full weight of our situation crashed down on us. Packing our essentials into cardboard boxes felt like dismantling 20 years of shared dreams, but each item I wrapped in newspaper represented another step toward freedom. The cramped 2-bedroom apartment I found across town wasn't much thin walls, questionable plumbing, a view of the grain elevator instead of cornfields, but it was ours, and Tom couldn't find us there. The financial reality hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. My salary from the bakery barely covered rent on our new apartment, let alone legal fees and therapy sessions for Lily. Within weeks, I was working 3 jobs just to keep us afloat: the bakery at dawn, where I shaped loaves in the pre-dawn darkness; a diner on the highway until midnight, where I served coffee and pie to truckers and traveling salesmen; and weekend cleaning for wealthy families on the other side of town, where I scrubbed their toilets and polished their silver while they attended country club functions. We sold everything of value: our old Buick that Tom had lovingly maintained, my grandmother's wedding ring that had been in our family for 3 generations, even Max's bicycle that he'd gotten for his 10th birthday. Food came from the church pantry and community donations, stretching every dollar until it screamed in protest. I remember one particularly low moment, standing in my boss's office at the bakery with flour still coating my apron, begging for an advance on my paycheck. "Mrs. Sullivan, I know this is unusual, but Lily's therapy appointment is tomorrow and I'm $30 short. I can work extra shifts this weekend to make up for it." Mrs. Sullivan, a kind woman whose own daughter had faced troubles, reached into her purse without hesitation. "Eleanor, you take what you need. That girl comes first always. Don't you worry about working it off. You do more than enough around here already." Those small acts of kindness kept us going when everything else seemed hopeless, reminding me that not everyone in our community had turned against us, but for every person who showed compassion, there seemed to be 2 who judged us harshly. The harassment escalated as word spread through our small town. Tom's brother Robert cornered me behind Sullivan's bakery one morning as I was loading supplies from the delivery truck, his face red with anger and alcohol. "You're destroying a good man over nothing," he snarled, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. "Tom made a mistake, sure, but men make mistakes. You're tearing apart this whole family because you can't forgive a moment of weakness." When I tried to walk past him toward the bakery's back door, he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises that would last for weeks. "That girl of yours is disturbed, Eleanor. Everyone in town knows it. She's been acting strange for months, making up stories for attention. Don't let her destroy Tom's life with her sick fantasies." I jerked away from his grip, my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my spine like ice. "Robert, your brother raped our daughter. I saw it with my own eyes. If you want to support a child molester, that's your choice, but stay away from my family." The harassment extended to my children as well. Max came home from school one day with a split lip and torn shirt, claiming he'd fallen off the playground equipment. But I knew better. Other boys had been taunting him about his father, calling him names I won't repeat, asking if he was going to grow up to be like Tom. Lily faced her own torments at school. Classmates whose parents remained loyal to Tom whispered cruel rumors in hallways, calling her a liar, and worse. Someone wrote "whore" across her locker in red lipstick. She came home one afternoon with torn clothes and scraped knees, claiming she'd fallen down the stairs. But I saw the fear in her eyes and knew she'd been pushed. That evening, as I cleaned Max's cuts and tried to explain why people were being cruel, he looked up at me with Tom's brown eyes and asked the question that haunted my nightmares. "Mama, am I bad like Daddy? Will I hurt people too when I grow up?" The innocence in his voice shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. I pulled him into my arms, holding him while he sobbed with confusion and fear about his own nature, his own future. "No, sweetheart," I whispered into his hair, breathing in the little boy scent of dirt and bubble gum. "You are nothing like what your father became. You have a good heart, Max, and that will never change." But I could see the doubt in his 10-year-old eyes, the fear that whatever sickness had consumed Tom might be lurking inside him too. The next few months were particularly difficult as Max struggled with rage and confusion that manifested in ways I wasn't prepared for. One evening in December, I found him in his room systematically tearing up his drawings of rocket ships, his face red with fury, and tears streaming down his cheeks. "I don't want to go to space anymore," he shouted when I tried to stop him. "Astronauts are heroes, and heroes don't come from families like ours. Dad ruined everything. He ruined Lily. He ruined you, and he ruined me too." He grabbed his composition notebook, the one filled with months of careful drawings and calculations, and hurled it against the wall pages, scattering like wounded birds across his bedroom floor. I sat on his bed and let him rage, understanding that he needed to release the poison that Tom's actions had injected into all our lives. When his anger finally exhausted itself, he collapsed against me, his small body shaking with grief for the father he'd lost and the future he thought was stolen from him. "Max," I said softly, stroking his hair as he cried, "your father's choices don't define who you are or what you can become. You are not responsible for his actions, and they don't limit your dreams. You can still reach the stars, sweetheart. This family's strength will get you there." It took weeks of patient conversation and therapy with Dr. Coleman before Max began to believe that his father's sins weren't his inheritance. But gradually, tentatively, he started drawing again, simple sketches at first, then more elaborate designs that showed his dreams weren't as destroyed as he'd feared. Therapy became our anchor in the storm that was threatening to drown us all. Dr. Sarah Coleman, a soft-spoken woman with silver hair and an office filled with art supplies and comfortable chairs, worked with Lily twice a week and with Max once weekly. Her waiting room became a safe haven, a place where we could speak freely about the unthinkable without fear of judgment or disbelief. Progress came in tiny increments that felt monumental to us, a day without nightmares, a genuine laugh at something Max said the first time Lily picked up her sketchbook again. But there were setbacks too, days when the weight of what we'd endured seemed too heavy to carry. During one particularly difficult session, Dr. Coleman gently encouraged Lily to share more about the months leading up to that October night. What emerged was a pattern of escalating behavior I'd been too blind or too afraid to see. Tom had been grooming her slowly and systematically, breaking down her boundaries and her ability to recognize inappropriate behavior. He started calling me special names. Lily whispered during one session, her voice barely audible. He'd say I was his little woman, and that I was prettier than all the other girls my age. He said I was growing up to be beautiful, just like you, Mama, but better. The compliments had been accompanied by increasingly inappropriate touching hands, lingering too long when he hugged her goodnight fingers trailing across her back in ways that made her skin crawl, accidental, brushes against her developing body that left her feeling confused and violated. He told me I was special. She continued, tears streaming down her face. He said I was his favorite, that our relationship was different from what he had with you or with Max. And when I tried to pull away or tell him I didn't like it, he'd get angry and say I was ungrateful that other fathers weren't as loving as him. The manipulation had been so subtle, so gradual, that she'd questioned her own instincts. He'd trained her to doubt herself, to believe that his attention was normal, loving something she should be grateful for rather than afraid of. The night it happened, she said, her voice growing stronger as she recounted the trauma. He came into my room and sat on my bed. He'd been drinking more than usual and he smelled terrible. He started touching my hair and telling me how beautiful I was, how I was becoming a woman. When I tried to get up, he pushed me back down and said it was time for me to learn what it meant to be special to him. The details were horrific, but hearing them helped me understand the full scope of what Tom had done to our family. This wasn't a single moment of drunken, poor judgment. It was the culmination of months of psychological and sexual abuse that I'd failed to recognize or prevent. I joined a support group for mothers of sexually abused children, meeting every Wednesday evening in the basement of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. The circle of folding chairs held women whose stories mirrored mine. The disbelief, the self-blame, the crushing weight of realizing they hadn't protected their children from the very people who should have kept them safe. Martha, whose ex-husband had abused their twin daughters, became a particular source of strength. She'd been through the court system 2 years earlier and understood the marathon ahead of us. The system isn't built for children, she warned me one evening as we lingered after group. It's built for doubt. You have to be stronger than the doubt, Eleanor. You have to believe your daughter, even when everyone else is questioning her. These women taught me that survival required more than just getting through each day. It required fighting for justice, for healing, for the future of our children. They showed me that strength could be found in the most broken places, that love could triumph over the darkest betrayals. Court delays dragged on for months, each continuance feeling like another blow to our hopes for justice. Tom's lawyer, a slick man named Davidson, who wore expensive suits and reeked of aftershave, employed every delaying tactic possible. Continuances for additional preparation time. Motions to suppress evidence. Requests for psychological evaluations of Lily's credibility. Each setback felt like a kick to the stomach, but small victories kept us going. Emergency custody granted the restraining order, upheld character witnesses willing to testify about Tom's drinking and increasingly erratic behavior. The community slowly began to fracture along invisible lines that revealed people's true characters. Some families stood by us quietly, leaving groceries on our doorstep or slipping $20 bills into my purse at church. Others made their disapproval known through cold shoulders and whispered conversations that stopped when we entered rooms. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store surprised me one day by squeezing my hand as she bagged our few purchases. "I believe your girl Eleanor," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "My own daddy did things to me when I was young. Well, things that weren't talked about back then. You're doing right by her standing up like this." Those moments of support felt like oxygen when I was drowning in doubt and exhaustion, reminding me that we weren't completely alone in our fight for justice. Amid the grinding battle of daily survival and legal preparation, a revelation emerged that changed everything. Detective Morrison called me to the station on a cold February morning, his expression more serious than usual as he gestured for me to sit across from his desk. Mrs. Murphy," he said, sliding a manila folder across the scarred wooden surface. We've uncovered some information about your husband's past that you need to see. Inside the folder were documents I never knew existed, a complaint filed 3 years earlier by a young woman named Patricia Wells, who'd worked as a secretary at Henderson's garage. She'd reported that Tom had cornered her at the office Christmas party, made inappropriate advances, and threatened her job when she rebuffed him. The complaint had been buried, dismissed, as she said by a police department that preferred not to investigate prominent local businessmen, and Patricia had eventually quit and moved to Des Moines to escape the situation. But there was more. A former neighbor from Tom's childhood street had contacted police after seeing his name in the local paper. She remembered Tom's teenage years, how he'd been accused of peeping into girls' windows, though nothing had been proven. His own sister had mentioned almost casually that their female cousins had always seemed uncomfortable around him at family gatherings, making excuses to avoid being alone with him. The pattern stretched back years, decades even. This wasn't an isolated incident brought on by alcohol and stress. This was a predator who'd been operating in plain sight for most of his adult life, protected by a community's willingness to believe that nice men who fixed cars and coached Little League couldn't be capable of such darkness. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless and nauseous. I'd lived with this man for 20 years, shared a bed with him, trusted him with our children's safety, defended him to friends who'd hinted that his drinking was becoming a problem. How many signs had I missed? How many times had his victims tried to speak up, only to be silenced by the same doubts that had initially plagued our case? But the discovery also brought unexpected validation. Lily's account wasn't the confused memory of a traumatized teenager, it was one piece of a much larger, more sinister puzzle. The shame I'd carried, the guilt over not protecting her sooner, began to transform into righteous anger. When I told Lily about the other women, she wept not from renewed trauma, but from relief that seemed to pour out of her like water from a broken dam. I thought it was my fault, she whispered through her tears. I thought I did something to make him want to hurt me. I thought maybe I was sending signals or that I was a bad person somehow. The revelation gave her the courage to commit fully to testifying, to facing Tom in court, and speaking her truth regardless of who might doubt her. What had started as our private hell was transforming into a stand for broader justice, exposing how silence enables predators to move freely through communities, leaving destruction in their wake. As the trial date approached in early spring, the pressure from Tom's supporters intensified, but our resolve had crystallized into something unbreakable. We'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing to act, despite the terror, choosing truth over comfort, choosing justice over false peace. The courtroom on the morning of Tom's trial felt like a stark arena where truth would battle denial under fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh relief. I'd never been inside the courthouse before. It was an imposing building with marble floors and wood-paneled walls that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort those seeking justice. Lily sat beside me in the front row, wearing the blue dress we'd bought at Penny's for the occasion. At 14, she looked impossibly young and fragile, but her posture was straight, and her chin lifted with quiet determination that reminded me of my own mother. Max stayed with Martha from our support group, spared from witnessing what promised to be a brutal examination of our family's darkest moments. Tom entered in handcuffs, wearing a suit I'd pressed for him countless times over the years. He looked older, grayer, diminished somehow without the swagger that alcohol had given him. His eyes swept the courtroom and landed briefly on Lily before darting away, unable to hold her gaze. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Janet Morrison, who'd specialized in sexual assault cases for over a decade, laid out the evidence methodically. Medical findings from the rape kit, timeline of events from that October night, testimony about Tom's drinking pattern and escalating inappropriate behavior. The previous complaints that established a pattern of predatory conduct stretching back years. When Lily took the stand, the courtroom fell silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's pen and the distant hum of the building's heating system. She placed her small hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth in a voice that barely carried to the back of the room. But as she began to speak, describing that night in clear, precise detail, her voice grew stronger with each word. He came into my room around 11:30 that night. She said, her eyes focused on a point just above the jury's heads. He was drunk. I could smell the whiskey on his breath from across the room. He sat on my bed and started touching my hair, telling me I was beautiful, that I was becoming a woman. Tom's defense attorney Davidson objected frequently, trying to rattle her with technical interruptions. But Lily pressed on, describing how Tom had pushed her down when she tried to leave, how he'd covered her mouth when she started to cry, how he'd forced himself on her while she begged him to stop. I kept saying, "Daddy, please don't." She testified, tears streaming down her face, but her voice never wavering. I kept pushing against him, but he was too strong. He kept saying it was okay, that this was how fathers showed love to their special daughters, that I should be grateful he chose me. The defense's strategy became clear during cross-examination. Lily, as a troubled teenager seeking attention, suggests that I'd coached her testimony out of spite toward Tom, imply that her memory was unreliable due to trauma. Davidson questioned every detail with the precision of a surgeon and the compassion of a snake. Isn't it true, Miss Murphy, that you've been having behavioral problems at school? He asked, his tone patronizing and dismissive. Isn't it true that you've been seeking attention through dramatic stories? Haven't you always been jealous of your parents' relationship? But Lily had been prepared for this by Dr. Coleman, who'd worked with her for months to understand that the defense would try to make her the villain of her own assault. Her response was calm and devastating. Sir, she said, looking directly at Davidson with eyes that held more wisdom than any 14-year-old should possess. I know what happened to me. I know the difference between a father's love and what he did to me that night. No amount of questions will change what I experienced, and no amount of blame will make it my fault. The medical examiner testified about physical evidence consistent with sexual assault. Detective Morrison presented the timeline and the pattern of previous complaints that painted Tom as a serial predator. Character witnesses spoke about his drinking problem and increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the assault. But the most damaging testimony came from Patricia Wells, who'd traveled from Des Moines to face her own abuser. She described the Christmas party incident with devastating clarity, how Tom had cornered her in the office supply room and forced his hands under her blouse while promising to fire her if she reported him. He told me it was just harmless fun, she said, her voice shaking but determined. He said if I couldn't handle a little attention from the boss, maybe I wasn't cut out for office work. I was 22 years old and needed that job desperately. I believed it was my fault for wearing a dress he found attractive. Her testimony established the pattern that prosecutors needed. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a long history of predatory behavior that Tom had hidden behind his reputation as a good family man. When Tom finally took the stand in his own defense, he presented himself as a man destroyed by alcohol, claiming he had no memory of that October night. He wept as he apologized to Lily, but his tears felt performative, calculated to generate sympathy rather than express genuine remorse. I love my daughter more than life itself, he said, his voice breaking theatrically. I would never intentionally hurt her. If I did what she says I did, it was the alcohol talking, not me. I'm a sick man who needs help, not prison. The prosecutor's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. She walked Tom through his drinking patterns, his previous complaints, his deliberate choice to continue drinking despite its effects on his family. She forced him to admit that he'd been functional enough to drive home that night, functional enough to climb the stairs to Lily's room, functional enough to overpower a 14-year-old girl. Mr. Murphy, she said, her voice cutting through his excuses like a blade. You've testified that you don't remember assaulting your daughter, but you do remember her pushing against you, don't you? You remember her crying and begging you to stop. Tom's composure cracked completely under her relentless questioning. I was drunk, I wasn't thinking clearly. But you were thinking clearly enough to tell her to keep quiet about it, weren't you? You were thinking clearly enough to threaten her if she told anyone. You were thinking clearly enough to try to convince her that what you were doing was normal. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Tom had revealed more than he'd intended, confirming details from Lily's testimony that he'd claimed not to remember. The jury deliberated for 4 hours that felt like 4 years. I paced the courthouse hallway, my hands clasped in silent prayer, while Lily sat quietly on a bench, sketching in her notebook, a landscape showing storm clouds clearing to reveal sunshine breaking through hope emerging from darkness. When the bailiff called us back into the courtroom, my heart hammered so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The foreman, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested he worked with them for a living, stood to deliver the verdict that would determine our family's future. On the charge of sexual assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom like freedom itself. Tom's shoulders slumped in defeat, his face crumpling as the reality of his conviction sank in. His relatives gasped and wept, but I felt only an overwhelming wash of relief and vindication that made my knees weak. Judge Harrison sentenced Tom to 15 years in state prison, noting the particularly heinous nature of his crime against his own child. "Mr. Murphy," he said, his voice stern and final, "you violated the most sacred trust that exists, the trust between a parent and child. Your daughter will carry the scars of your actions for the rest of her life, while you will serve as an example that our community will not tolerate such predatory behavior." As Tom was led away in handcuffs, he turned back once to look at us. But instead of the remorse, I might have hoped to see his eyes held only resentment and self-pity. Even in defeat, he couldn't accept responsibility for the destruction he'd caused. Outside the courthouse, Lily and I held each other and wept, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, justice, and the beginning of true healing. The fight was over, and we had won. With Tom incarcerated and our legal battles behind us, we sought solace in starting over completely. The insurance money from selling our house, combined with donations from supporters who'd emerged during the trial, gave us enough to relocate to Cedar Rapids, a larger city where anonymity was possible and fresh starts weren't questioned. Our new home was modest, a small 2-story house with a fenced backyard where Max could play without worrying about suspicious neighbors. Sunlight filtered through clean windows, and the walls held no memories of whiskey bottles or broken trust. Lily chose the room facing east, where morning light would illuminate her art supplies, while Max claimed the smaller back bedroom where he could display his growing collection of space books and model rockets. But healing proved more complex than simply changing addresses. Therapy continued for all of us, unraveling layers of pain and mistrust that Tom's betrayal had created. Dr. Coleman referred us to a family therapist in Cedar Rapids, a gentle man named Dr. James Reed, who specialized in trauma recovery. The work was exhausting, full of setbacks that left us wondering if we'd ever feel normal again. Lily's nightmares persisted for months, pulling us into late-night talks, where we'd sit together in her bed talking through fears and flashbacks until dawn. She struggled with intimacy of any kind. Even innocent gestures like hugs felt threatening to her damaged trust. Arguments flared from built-up stress and unprocessed emotions. Max, now 11 and trying to understand his place in our transformed family, sometimes lashed out at Lily, blaming her for ruining everything and making them move away from friends. During one particularly difficult session, he screamed at her that he wished she'd never told that he missed his dad and their old life. The words hit Lily like physical blows, sending her running to her room in tears. I found myself caught between my children's competing needs, Max's grief for the father he'd lost and the life he'd known, and Lily's need for validation and safety. But progress came in waves, building slowly but surely. Lily began drawing again, tentative strokes that gradually gained confidence. Her landscapes evolved from dark storm scenes to images of sunrise and renewal. Max found his footing through a local astronomy club where his passion for space exploration connected him with other boys who shared his dreams. 3 years after the trial, our healing reached a milestone I hadn't dared hope for. Lily, now 17 and preparing for college, had grown into a young woman of remarkable strength and compassion. She'd been accepted to the University of Iowa with plans to study psychology, driven by a desire to help other survivors navigate their own recovery. The night before her high school graduation, we sat together on our back porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "Mama," she said, her voice soft in the evening air. "I've been thinking about that night a lot lately. Not the bad parts, but what came after. How you fought for me when everyone said I was lying. How you believed me when I could barely believe myself." 2 years later, I met Daniel, a widowed father of 2, who taught high school literature in our town. Our relationship grew from mutual respect and shared understanding of life's fragility. When I introduced him to Lily and Max, his gentle nature made him non-threatening in ways that surprised us all. Our wedding was small and intimate, just immediate family and close friends who'd supported us through our darkest times. As Daniel and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, I felt the final pieces of our healing click into place. 6 years after Tom's conviction, Lily and I were approached about sharing our story publicly. The conference was held at the University of Iowa, where we spoke to social workers, law enforcement officers, and survivors about our journey from victim to advocate. "For years, I thought my father's actions defined me," Lily told the audience. "But my mother taught me that we get to choose how our stories end. Trauma may write the first chapters, but we hold the pen for the rest." When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the faces in the audience. "Your children are watching," I concluded. "When you choose to believe them, to fight for them, you teach them that they have value beyond their ability to keep family secrets." 6 months later, we received news that Tom had died in prison of liver failure. My first emotion was relief that he could never hurt another child. Lily's response was more complex, grieving not for the man who'd assaulted her, but for the father she'd loved before that night. As I finish writing this story, 8 years have passed since that stormy night that changed everything. Lily is 25, now married to a kind man who knows her story and loves her strength. They're expecting their first child next spring, a daughter they plan to name Hope. Max graduated high school as valedictorian and is studying aerospace engineering at MIT. Daniel and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary last month. Our advocacy work has expanded, and we now speak regularly at training seminars. On quiet evenings, when our blended family gathers in our living room, I'm struck by the miracle of ordinary happiness. We are not the family I once imagined we'd be, but we are the family we chose to become through love, courage, and relentless hope. This is how our story ends, not with bitterness or despair, but with gratitude for the strength we discovered in ourselves and each other. Not with the family we started with, but with the family we chose to become. Not with the innocence we lost, but with the wisdom we gained and the hope we can offer others walking similar paths. We are living proof that even the worst trauma cannot destroy a family that refuses to give up on each other.